There is a rule that every government understands, but never writes down. Some discoveries are too dangerous to be true. Not dangerous because they are wrong, dangerous because they are right. Because the moment they become public, everything that has been carefully built around them begins to crack. When that happens, governments do not deny the discovery. They do something far more effective. They file it. November 19th, 1929. The temperature at the Ross Ice Shelf was 41 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that doesn't feel like cold anymore. A geologist named Dr. Harold Svensson was on his knees in that cold, his bare hands pressed against an ice core that his drilling equipment had just pulled from 260 feet beneath the surface. He was not supposed to be the important man on this expedition. That was Admiral Richard Byrd, national hero, celebrated aviator, the first man to fly over the South Pole. Byrd's name was on the letterhead. Byrd's face was in the newspapers. Byrd would receive the Congressional Gold Medal when they returned. Svensson was the man with the drill, and on November 19th, 1929, the drill found something that Harold Svensson spent the rest of his life not being allowed to explain. That night, Svensson wrote in his personal journal, a journal that is not in any government archive, not at the National Archives, not at the Ohio State University, where the bulk of the Byrd expedition records are held, but in a cardboard box in a house in Minnesota, kept by his grandson, a retired schoolteacher, who has spent 12 years trying to get someone official to look at it. The formation at depth is unlike anything in the literature. The thermal signature alone suggests an active system. Wallace and I have discussed this for 3 hours. We are looking at geothermal activity at a scale that should not be possible. I do not know what this means for the surface stability. I do not think anyone does. Geothermal activity, active, ongoing, beneath one of the largest ice shelves on the planet. In 1929, this was not supposed to exist. The science of the time said it could not exist here. Not at this scale, not in this location, but there it was, in the thermal readings, in the core sample, in the careful, precise field notation of a trained geologist who had no reason to fabricate anything, and every professional reason to document exactly what he saw. He documented it, and then the system that was supposed to hold that documentation made it disappear. To understand how, you have to understand what Antarctica was in 1929. Not what it is now, an international scientific preserve, ringed with research stations, protected by treaty. That came later. That was built deliberately on top of what certain governments had already privately learned. In 1929, Antarctica was a race. Britain had claimed sectors. Norway had claimed sectors. Australia, New Zealand, France, all of them had drawn lines on maps, planted flags on ice, submitted formal territorial claims to land none of them had fully explored. The claims overlapped. The legal foundations were shaky, and the urgency behind them had almost nothing to do with science. The continent beneath the ice was, potentially, the largest untapped mineral storehouse on Earth. Coal deposits, iron ore, and beneath the ice shelves, geological formations, whose surface characteristics suggested resources that the post-war industrial world was going to need, in quantities its known reserves could not provide. This was not in the newspapers. This was in the rooms where ministers sat with scientific advisors and spoke the careful language of men who understood the difference between what was known and what should be said. The Byrd expedition was, officially, a mission of exploration and national pride. Officially, But here is the part the official account leaves out entirely. The geological component of the expedition, Svensson's drilling work, the subsurface sampling program, was funded in part through a channel that does not appear in the expedition's public financial disclosures. A consortium of American industrial interests, primarily mining companies with early-stage petroleum exploration connections, contributed to the expedition's equipment budget through an intermediary foundation. This is not speculation. It is in the personal correspondence of Edsel Ford, one of the expedition's primary backers, whose papers contain a reference to industrial partners, whose participation in the venture is best maintained as a private matter. Private, not secret. There is a difference, and institutions are very skilled at maintaining it. These industrial partners wanted geological data before the territorial question was settled. Before any international agreement could restrict access, or allow a government to claim and license the resources on its own terms, they wanted the first look at what was down there. Svensson's drill gave them that look, and what he found was so far beyond what anyone had briefed him to expect, so that the expedition's leadership spent the remaining weeks on the ice, deciding not what to do with the discovery, but what to do with Svensson. The bird expedition returned to the United States in June 1930. Parades, a reception at the White House. Bird received the Congressional Gold Medal. Before a joint session of Congress, the expedition's official scientific reports were published by the National Geographic Society. They described the geological survey work as having confirmed the broad outlines of existing knowledge about Antarctic subsurface conditions. Read that sentence carefully. It does not say the survey produced no new findings. It says the findings confirmed what was already known. But what was already known in 1930 was almost nothing. The baseline was so thin that confirming its broad outlines was a statement that sounded like information, and contained almost none. Svensson's name does not appear in any of the official geological reports. His drilling logs are listed in a 1931 archive inventory, received, catalogued, filed. They are not in the archive now. The thermal readings he documented have never been published, referenced, or responded to in any scientific literature. And Dr. Frederick Wallace, the colleague Svensson spent 3 hours with. His expedition papers are held. The folders are there. They are labeled. They are empty. Here is where the story turns, because the man who managed the removal of Svensson's findings from the institutional record was not a government official, not an industrial operative, not a faceless bureaucrat processing paperwork in a federal building. It was the expedition's own chief scientist, Dr. Lawrence Gould, a geologist of genuine distinction, reviewed Svensson's preliminary findings in January 1930. In the final weeks of the expedition, while the ship was still in the ice, his private correspondence from that period is archived, largely intact, and in a letter dated January 14th, 1930, addressed to a colleague, Gould writes, "There are elements of the geological survey that will require careful handling before they can be appropriately contextualized for publication. The institutional readiness to absorb certain findings does not yet exist, and premature disclosure would serve neither science nor the broader interests at stake." Institutional readiness, broader interests. This is not the language of a villain. This is the language of a man who has made a rational calculation that the truth is something to be managed, not released, that the right time to know a thing is not when you discover it, but when the people who hold power have decided the world is ready. Gould was not evil. That is the most disturbing part of this story. He was institutional, and institutional at a high enough level, produces the same outcomes as evil, without any of the psychological discomfort. The mechanism that erased Svensson's findings operated on 3 simultaneous levels. And this is the key to understanding why it worked so completely. The American government's interest was territorial. Svensson's discovery would have internationalized the Antarctic territorial conversation immediately. Britain, Norway, and others would have recognized the implications. A geologically active subglacial system meant the geological picture of the entire region needed reassessment. It meant resources. It meant competing claims. It meant a diplomatic crisis that the American government in 1930 was not positioned to manage. The industrial consortium's interest was commercial. They had paid for the first look. They needed time to assess what they were looking at before the information became public and triggered a commercial scramble that would destroy their advantage, and the scientific establishment's interest was the quietest and most powerful of the 3. Institutional science in 1930 was a small world. The senior figures who controlled journal access, research funding, and academic appointments. They were a community that could be managed by a small number of well-placed people. Gould was one of them. He did not need to issue orders. He needed only to delay. Arthur wrote, to place findings in the category of requires further review, and then ensure that the review never formally concluded. 3 separate interests, 1 shared outcome, and no single instruction that could ever be quoted as proof. This pattern, a discovery made, its implications recognized, its release timed and controlled by the people with institutional power over it, does not begin or end with Antarctica. In the 1950s, the full extent of North Sea oil reserves was known to British geological surveys years before public acknowledgement. The disclosure timeline shaped by private conversations between government ministries and energy companies. The disclosure timeline shaped by private conversations between government ministries and energy companies, positioning for the licensing agreements that would follow. In the 1970s, rare earth mineral assessments in Central Africa were shared privately among state and corporate actors and kept from public scientific literature until the commercial architecture around those deposits was established. The discoveries vary. The mechanism is identical. A finding is made. Its implications are assessed privately. The institutional gatekeepers make a judgment that the finding is not ready to be known. And then they hold the gap between what they know and what is recorded, using the perfectly legal, perfectly deniable tools of reclassification, archival delay, and the bureaucratic power of never formally responding. In 1958, 1 year before the Antarctic Treaty was signed, the United States Geological Survey produced an internal classified assessment of Antarctic subsurface geology, drawing on data from multiple expeditions over 3 decades. That document was declassified in 1994 under a Freedom of Information request by a University of Colorado researcher who found a reference to it in a 1961 State Department footnote. The 1958 USGS assessment, 93 pages, partially redacted even in its declassified version, describes the geological characteristics of the Ross Sea region in terms that align precisely with Svensson's 1929 field journal. It references a subglacial thermal system in the western Ross sector. It notes that evidence for this system had been identified in early survey work, without naming when, without naming who. 29 years of private knowledge. sitting in classified assessments and empty archive folders, while the public record stayed clean. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. 12 nations agreed to set aside territorial claims. It dedicated the continent to peaceful science and mandate free exchange of findings among all signatories. History records it as a triumph of international cooperation. One of the Cold War's genuine diplomatic achievements. But look at who signed it. The nations that signed the Antarctic Treaty were the nations that had conducted the most significant pre-treaty expeditions. They were the nations that had already seen what was down there. They had already made their private assessments. They had already had the conversations. In the rooms where ministers sit with scientific advisors about what the geological picture actually looked like. The treaty did not resolve the territorial question by making the discovery public. It resolved it by making the competition stop before any single party could claim a result. The shared access framework is also a shared disclosure framework. No finding could be made public by one nation alone. Everything had to go through the collective scientific channels of the treaty system, the channels that the same institutional actors controlled. The treaty was not just a peace agreement. It was the most sophisticated archival management tool ever constructed. The existence of subglacial lakes in Antarctica was not formally confirmed until 1973, when satellite evidence revealed Lake Vostok, a body of liquid water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, sitting beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. The scientific world treated it as a revelation, as something new, but the geological dynamics are ancient and slow-moving. They do not develop in decades. They were present in 1929. He was at the edge of something far larger than he had words for. The system that was supposed to hold that knowledge chose instead to hold the silence. For 44 years, Harold Svensson retired from academic geology in 1947. He moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, a quiet man who kept his journals close. That the most important thing he had ever found was the thing he had been prevented from explaining. The ice keeps its own record. It was already found. What else is sitting at 260 feet? What else was found, recorded, filed, and made invisible? What else are we still not ready for?